The lawyer slid a single brass key across the polished oak desk, and Margaret Ashford understood in that exact second that her mother had spent 40 years lying to her. Not the cruel kind of lying, the other kind. The kind a woman does when she loves someone so much she cannot risk the world finding out. The key was no bigger than a thimble worn smooth at the edges, and it sat between Margaret's coffee cup and a manila folder that contained the last words Eleanor Ashford would ever say to her 3 children. Outside the second-floor window of the law office on Main Street, Brattleboro, Vermont, a single red maple leaf came loose from a branch and drifted past the glass slow as a held breath. Margaret stared at the key. She did not know yet that it would open a room she had walked past 5,000 times. She did not know yet that the answer to every cruel question she had asked herself in the last 6 years was waiting behind a wall she had been told was empty. If you have ever been the child who stayed, the one who packed the bags, who learned the medications, who held the hand at 3 in the morning while everyone else lived their bright, loud lives in other cities, then sit with me tonight. Pour something warm, pull the blanket up. This story is for you. And before we go any further into Margaret's house and Eleanor's secret and the small cedar shed at the end of a gravel path in Vermont, take 1 second to subscribe and turn on the bell. Because what Margaret finds behind that wall changes the meaning of every quiet sacrifice she ever made. Stay with me. The fire is lit. The story is just beginning. Margaret was 42 years old, and she had buried her mother 11 days ago. She sat in the middle chair of 3. Her brother Calvin was on her left in a charcoal suit that had not creased once during the 4-hour drive from the Burlington airport. He was 48, a cardiothoracic surgeon at a hospital in Seattle, and he wore his grief the way he wore everything else, like a clean shirt tucked in tight. On her right sat Vivian, 45, who ran a small florist shop in Charleston and had flown up that morning in a black cashmere wrap that smelled faintly of orange blossom and airport coffee. Vivian's nails tapped the wooden armrest in a rhythm Margaret recognized from childhood. It meant Vivian was bored, and Vivian being bored meant Vivian was uncomfortable, and Vivian being uncomfortable meant something difficult was about to be said out loud. The lawyer was a man named Caldwell. He was in his late 60s with the kind of slow, careful voice that came from a lifetime of telling people things they did not want to hear. He had handled Eleanor Ashford's affairs for 19 years. He opened the folder. He set a pair of half-moon reading glasses on the end of his nose. The radiator under the window ticked twice. Your mother, Mr. Caldwell said, was unusually specific. More specific than most clients I work with. I would like you to remember that as we go through the document. Calvin glanced once at his watch. Margaret saw him do it and looked away. The house first. The white farmhouse on Putney Mountain Road, 4 bedrooms. The wraparound porch where Eleanor had read aloud to her grandchildren every August for as long as anyone could remember the apple orchard. The stone wall their father had built the summer before he died. All of it. To Calvin. Calvin nodded once the way a man nods when a verdict has gone the way he expected it to go. That makes sense, he said. I'm the eldest. Nobody asked whether it made sense to anyone else. Margaret felt Vivian shift in her chair. The savings account next. $58,400 in a money market at the Brattleboro Savings and Loan. The 1978 Buick Electra parked under the carport, the one Eleanor had refused to sell because it had been their father's, the one that still smelled like the pipe tobacco he had given up 2 years before he passed. Both. To Vivian. Vivian uncrossed her ankles. Oh, she said softly. Okay. Then Mr. Caldwell paused. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Margaret, and something in his face moved very slightly, the way the surface of a pond moves when something is rising from underneath. He cleared his throat. To my youngest daughter, Margaret Eleanor Ashford, he read, I leave the Cedar storage shed located behind the property on Putney Mountain Road, including the cedar wardrobe inside total appraised value $15. Margaret heard the radiator tick again. She heard a car go by on the street below. She heard her sister inhale. 6 years. 6 years of her life. And they had appraised it at $15. Calvin leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. That's it, he said. It was not a question. It was a fact stated for the record the way he stated things at hospital case reviews. That is what your mother wrote, Mr. Caldwell said. Margaret kept her eyes on the folder. Her mother's signature was at the bottom of the page. Even from where she sat, she could see it. The handwriting had been shaky in those last months. But the loop of the E in Eleanor was the same loop Margaret had watched her mother make on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the inside cover of every book she had ever given her daughter. The signature was dated 8 months before her mother died, long before the worst of the confusion. Long before the morning, Eleanor had looked at Margaret across the breakfast table and asked with perfect calm, "Who is the kind woman who keeps coming into my house?" "I'm sure Mom had her reasons," Vivian said in the voice she used at the shop when a difficult customer was on the way out. Calvin stood. He buttoned his jacket. He came around the back of Margaret's chair and put a hand on her shoulder briefly, the way he used to touch her shoulder when she was 9 and had skinned her knee on the gravel drive. "It's what she wanted, Meg. You know Mom wasn't trying to hurt anybody. A shed is just a shed." Margaret did not turn her head. Calvin and Vivian left together. She heard their voices in the carpeted hallway, low and brisk, already discussing the drive back to the house, the locks, the realtor they would have to call. The door clicked shut. Mr. Caldwell did not move. He waited. He waited until the footsteps on the stairs had faded all the way down to the street. "Miss Ashford." Margaret looked up. "Your mother sat in that chair, the one your brother just sat in when she came to write this will. She was here for 2 hours and 7 minutes. Most of my clients are done in 20. Mr. Caldwell took off his glasses. He folded them slowly and set them on the folder. "She told me more than once that each of her children was going to receive exactly what they needed." Those were her words. I remember because I wrote them down afterwards. I do not normally write down what my clients say, but I wrote down what she said. He picked up the small brass key and held it out across the desk. "She also told me the day she signed that I should give you this directly and only after the others had left the room. I have kept it in my drawer for 8 months. It is yours now." Margaret took the key. It was warm from his palm. It was the size of her thumbnail. "What does it open?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment the way an old country lawyer looks at a young woman he has watched grow up from a distance. "I do not know, Miss Ashford. Your mother did not tell me. She only said that the one who stayed would know what to do with it." Margaret walked down the carpeted stairs and out into the flat October light of Main Street. Calvin's rental was already gone. Vivian was standing on the sidewalk by her own car, sunglasses on against the low afternoon sun, a tissue crumpled in her fist that she had not used. "Meg," Vivian said. Margaret stopped. "I know this isn't what you expected." "I didn't expect anything," Margaret said. Vivian pulled her sunglasses down to the bridge of her nose. "Mom wasn't herself those last 2 years. You know that better than anyone. The forgetfulness, the little episodes. She probably just forgot to update things and Mr. Caldwell didn't push her on it. She wrote the will 8 months ago, Vivian. She was still herself." Vivian opened her mouth. She closed it. She pushed her sunglasses back up. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said. "You won't." Vivian got in the car. The engine started. Margaret stood on the sidewalk and watched the rental sedan turn at the light and disappear down Canal Street, and she did not move until the sound of it was gone. She had moved home 6 years ago. She had been 36 single working 12-hour shifts in the pediatric oncology ward at Boston Children's, raising a 2-year-old daughter named Lily in a third-floor walk-up in Jamaica Plain. Lily's father had not been part of the picture since the second trimester, and Margaret had stopped explaining that to people long ago. She had a life. It was a small, careful life, but it was hers. Then her mother had begun to fall. The first time it was nothing, a bruise on the hip. Eleanor laughed about it on the phone, said she had tripped on the threshold of the kitchen, said the rug was old and she should have replaced it years ago. The second time was the staircase. The third time was the bathtub. And after the third time, the neurologist used the word Parkinson's for the first time. And then 6 months later, he used the words mild cognitive impairment. And then a year after that, he stopped using qualifying adjectives altogether. Margaret had given Boston up in 11 days. She had sublet the apartment, given the cat to the upstairs neighbor, packed Lily's stuffed rabbit and her own scrubs into the back of a 2009 Honda, and driven 3.5 hours north on a Tuesday in March, with the heat broken and the windshield wipers smearing wet snow across the glass. Lily had slept the whole way. Margaret had cried somewhere around White River Junction and stopped before she crossed the town line. The first year had been the easy year, which is a thing you only understand later. Eleanor still cooked. Eleanor still knew the names of the cardinals at the feeder. Margaret took a part-time position at a pediatric clinic in town, drove Lily to the church preschool every morning, and at night she sat in the kitchen with her mother and helped her finish the crossword. Eleanor was teaching her how to do a proper cross-stitch in those evenings, the same way her own grandmother had taught her 60-some years before in a farmhouse outside Bennington. This stitch holds everything together, her mother had said, drawing the thread through the muslin with hands that had not yet started to tremble. When other stitches give up, this one keeps the cloth from coming apart. You remember that, Meg? The cross-stitch holds. Everything else is just decoration. The second year was harder. Eleanor began to leave the kettle on the stove. Eleanor began to call Margaret by her aunt's name, a woman dead 20 years. One evening in February, Margaret came down to the kitchen and found her mother standing barefoot at the open back door, looking out at the snow on the porch. And when Margaret said, "Mom, what are you doing?" Eleanor turned with a smile of complete strange tenderness and said, "I was waiting for my mother to come home." The third year, Eleanor stopped recognizing Margaret in the mornings. By afternoon, she usually came back. By evening, she was Margaret's mother again. But the mornings were a country Margaret learned to enter quietly. She would knock on the bedroom door. She would say, "Mrs. Ashford, it's just me, the nurse. I'm here to help you with the day." And Eleanor, who had been a librarian at the elementary school for 31 years, who had read aloud to 4 generations of Brattleboro children, would nod politely and let a stranger button her cardigan. Calvin called once a month. The conversation did not vary. "How's Mom doing?" "She doesn't know who I am, Cal." "That's tough, Meg. I wish I could be there more." "Then come. I've got a transplant case Thursday, you know how it is." She knew how it was. Vivian sent money twice in 6 years. $300 the first time, $300 the second. Margaret had used both checks on the pharmacy bill for 1 month of Eleanor's medications, and there had been $41 left over. She had used the $41 on a winter coat for Lily. Eleanor died on a Thursday morning in early March. Margaret was holding her right hand. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. Margaret nodded and did not say what she thought, which was that peaceful was a word people used when they had not watched a mind go dark 1 room at a time for 6 years. Calvin flew in for the funeral. Vivian drove up from Charleston. They wore black. They cried at the appropriate parts of the service. They stood at the graveside in the old cemetery on Cemetery Hill Road and accepted casseroles from neighbors whose names they had forgotten. They were gone within 40 hours, and then Margaret was alone in a farmhouse that still smelled like her mother's lavender hand cream and her mother's chamomile tea, with an 8-year-old daughter who kept asking when Grandma was coming back, and a $15 cedar shed she could not bring herself to walk to. 11 days passed. On the 11th day, she sat in Mr. Caldwell's office and took a brass key from his hand. She drove home from the lawyer's office with the key in the coin tray of her car. She did not look at it. At the stoplight on Western Avenue, she put her hand over it without looking, and she could feel its small warm weight under her palm. Lily was at the kitchen table doing a connect the dots in a paperback workbook when Margaret came in. The house was very quiet. The grandfather clock in the hall was the same clock that had ticked through Margaret's childhood, and it ticked now the way it had ticked then, slow and steady and patient as a heart. Mama, Lily said without looking up. What did the man say? He said Grandma loved us. I knew that, Lily said. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the back of the property. The orchard, the stone wall, the gravel path that ran from the house down past the woodshed, and the chicken coop that hadn't held a chicken in 20 years, and ended at the very back of the cleared land at the cedar shed. She had not been inside it once in 6 years. She had walked past it 1,000 times. As a child, she had been told it was full of her grandmother's old quilting things, fabric scraps, a frame, nothing of interest to a girl who wanted to be a nurse. The door had always been locked. The lock was a brass padlock the size of a child's fist, and the only key had hung on a nail inside her mother's kitchen cabinet behind the cinnamon and the cloves, where Eleanor had thought nobody noticed. Margaret had noticed. Children notice everything. They just do not always ask. For 2 weeks after the will reading, Margaret found reasons not to go. She told herself she was busy. She had Lily to feed the kitchen, to clean the laundry that had been piling up since before the funeral. She told herself the shed could wait. She told herself a $15 shed full of fabric scraps was not going to change anything. But on a Thursday morning in late October, with the maples on the property gone the color of struck matches and a low cold wind moving across the orchard, Lily came down the stairs in her boots and her purple coat and said, "Mama, I want to see Grandma's treasure." "There isn't any treasure, baby." "There is, though," Lily said. She said it the way an 8-year-old says a thing she has decided is true. "Grandma told me once. She said the shed had her best things in it. She said when I was bigger she would show me." Margaret stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her daughter. Lily had Eleanor's hands. Margaret had noticed it for the first time at the funeral. Small and square at the knuckle with long, careful fingers. Eleanor's hands. Her mother's hands given forward across a generation. "Okay," Margaret said. "Get your scarf." The gravel path was wet with last night's frost. Lily ran ahead. Margaret walked slowly. The cedar shed at the end of the path was smaller than she remembered, the way things from childhood always are. Gray weathered boards, a green metal roof gone soft with moss along the north edge. The brass padlock hung from the hasp exactly where it had hung when Margaret was Lily's age. She took the small key from her coat pocket. It was the key Mr. Caldwell had given her. She had not yet tried it. "It will not fit," she told herself. "This is the wrong key. The padlock will need a bigger key, and the small one will be for something else, and I will have to look for the right one in the house, and I will have a reason to put this off another week." She slid the key into the padlock. It turned. It turned smoothly. The brass shackle lifted on a hinge that someone had oiled, and recently, within the last few months, maybe within the last few weeks of her mother's life, when her hands had barely been able to hold a teacup, someone had come down this path and oiled this lock. Margaret took the padlock off the hasp. Her hands were not steady. The door swung inward on its own weight. The smell came out first. Cedar, of course, deep and rich and clean, the smell of a wood that does not give up its perfume even after 100 years. But underneath the cedar, something else. The faint mineral smell of old cotton, the waxy sweet smell of beeswax, the dust of dried lavender, the kind her mother used to sew into small muslin bags and tuck between the folded layers of a quilt to keep the moths away. Margaret had not smelled that combination since her grandmother's house 35 years ago, and she had not known until this moment that she had been missing it. Mama Lily said, "Look." In the dim light of the shed against the far wall stood the cedar wardrobe. It was tall, taller than Margaret, with two paneled doors and a small turned wooden knob on each. It was the wardrobe in the will, the $15 wardrobe. Around it, on the floor, in neat stacks against the walls, were folded quilts wrapped in muslin sheets. Margaret counted without meaning to. 8 stacks, maybe 9. She opened the wardrobe doors. Inside, hanging from a wooden rod, were more quilts on padded hangers. 8 or 10 of them, each one wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a length of cotton string. Margaret reached up and touched the corner of the nearest one, and the tissue crackled softly under her fingers, and her mother was suddenly and completely in the room with her. "Mama," Lily said again, and her voice was small now and curious. Margaret turned. Lily was on her hands and knees behind the wardrobe, peering into the narrow space between the back of the wardrobe and the cedar wall. Her purple coat was bunched up around her shoulders. "Mama, there's a hinge." Margaret crossed the shed in 3 steps and knelt beside her daughter. Lily was pointing. Margaret could see it now in the seam where the wardrobe met the wall, a thin dark line where there should have been wood. And at the top of the line, half hidden by the side of the wardrobe, a small black hinge. Margaret put her hand against the cedar wall and pushed. The wall did not move. She pushed against the wardrobe instead, gently, and the whole wardrobe slid sideways on a track she could not see, smooth and quiet as a held breath. And where the back of the wardrobe had been was a low, narrow doorway in the cedar paneling. And behind the doorway, in the gold autumn light spilling through a small high window, Margaret had never seen from outside, was a room she had not known existed. She could not move. Lily could not move. In the center of the room, on a long wooden frame that took up nearly the whole floor, was a quilt half finished, stretched and pinned and waiting. The pattern was a winter farmhouse in Vermont. The windows lit gold snow on the roof, and at 3 of the upstairs windows 3 small figures stood looking out. 3 women, a grandmother, a mother, a child. The figures were not yet finished. The grandmother had been completed. The mother was partly done. The child was only an outline in faint pencil, waiting for a hand that had not lived long enough to fill it in. On the side rail of the frame, tied with a length of plain cotton string, was a small paper tag. Margaret reached for it. Her fingers were trembling. The handwriting on the tag was her mother's, steady and careful and unmistakable, the loop of the E exactly as it had been on the will. For Margaret. Started 1982. Margaret was born in February of 1982. Behind her, very quietly, in a voice that did not understand yet what it had just found, but understood that something had been found, Lily said, "Mama, what's in here?" And Margaret, kneeling in the doorway of a room her mother had hidden from her for 40 years, holding a paper tag with her own name on it, could not yet answer. She did not answer Lily that morning. She could not. She knelt in the low cedar doorway with the paper tag pinched between her thumb and forefinger, and the only thing she could think clearly was that her mother had begun this quilt the same year Margaret had been born, and that meant her mother had been keeping a secret for a longer time than Margaret had been alive. "Lily," she said in the careful voice she used in the clinic when a child needed to hear something steady, "Honey, I need you to do something for me." Lily was still on her knees, staring past Margaret into the hidden room. "I need you to go back up to the house. Take off your boots in the mudroom. Pour yourself a glass of milk. Put on the carton with the rabbits. Mama will come up in a little while." "Is it Grandma's treasure?" Lily said. Margaret looked down at the tag in her hand. February of 1982, 41 years ago. Eleanor had been 33 years old, a young mother with 2 small children already, and a third on the way. And somewhere in that crowded young life she had stood at this frame and made the first careful pencil mark on this quilt, and written her newborn daughter's name on a paper tag and tied it with a piece of string. "Yes, baby," Margaret said. "I think it is." Lily went. She did not argue. Margaret listened to the small boots crunch back up the gravel path, and then the screen door of the mudroom, and then nothing but the wind moving across the orchard and the soft tick of the cedar walls warming in the morning sun. She stayed kneeling. She did not trust her legs yet. After a long while, she put her palm flat on the floor of the hidden room and pushed herself upright and stepped inside. The room was about 12 feet by 15. The ceiling was low. The high window she had never seen from outside, the one that had let in the gold light, faced east, and the morning sun came through it now in a single wide column that fell across the quilting frame and the stacks of folded cloth along the back wall and the small dark shape of a treadle sewing machine in the far corner. The machine was a Singer, the old kind. The kind with the iron base shaped like a wrought iron fence and the black enamel rubbed dull along the curve where a woman's wrist would have rested for 40 years. Margaret had never seen this machine in her mother's house. She had never heard it. Along the back wall, on long cedar shelves built into the studs, were the quilts. She counted them. She did not mean to. Counting was what she did when she could not feel things yet. There were 47 folded squares of muslin-wrapped cotton on those shelves, each one tied with cotton string, each one with a small paper tag tied to the string. She walked to the shelf and lifted the corner of the nearest tag. Her mother's handwriting, the same loop. Year 1991. Pattern Bear's Paw Double Bed. Sold to Henley June. $1,200. Margaret put the tag down. She picked up the one beside it, 1994. Mariner's Compass Queen. Sold to Henley, October. 2,400. She moved down the shelf. The dates moved forward through the 90s into the 2000s, into the 2010s. The dollar amounts climbed. 3,000, 4,500, 8,000. The most recent tag she found was dated 2.5 years ago, 18 months before Eleanor had stopped being able to thread a needle. Pattern Vermont Winter Variation. Sold to the Shelburne Museum Permanent Collection. $11,500. Margaret put her hand on the edge of the shelf to steady herself. A museum. Her mother had sold a quilt to a museum. She turned slowly in the middle of the room, the treadle in the corner, the frame with the half-finished farmhouse at its center, the 3 small women in their 3 small windows, a long pine work table along the south wall with a wooden box of cotton spools sorted by color from cream through saffron through deep wine red, a pegboard above the table where small scissors and rotary cutters and bone folders hung in outlines traced in fine black ink, every tool inside its own outline. Nothing missing. Margaret had seen a pegboard like that in only one other place in her life. Her grandfather's tool shed in Bennington 50 years ago when she was a child, young enough to be lifted up to see. Her mother had built this. Her mother who claimed she could not hammer a nail. On the work table near the wall sat a small wooden box. It was the size of a hardcover book, the lid carved with a simple cross-stitch motif, 4 small X's in a square. Margaret reached for it before she had decided to reach for it. The lid lifted easily. Inside, on a folded square of natural linen, lay a leather-bound ledger, and beneath the ledger, a small leatherette passbook from the Brattleboro Savings and Loan. She opened the passbook first. She did not know why, perhaps because numbers were easier than handwriting. The account was a joint account. 2 names were typed across the top in the small block letters of an old bank's old typewriter. Eleanor May Ashford, Margaret Eleanor Ashford. Below the names, a column of deposits going back 26 years, each one a number that matched a tag on a shelf. 1,200, 2,400, 3,000 even, 4,500. The last entry was 4 months before Eleanor died. The running balance at the bottom of the page was $287,416. Margaret sat down on the floor of the hidden room because her legs would not hold her. She did not cry. The thing she was feeling was too large for crying. It was the feeling of a door opening inside her chest, into a room she had not known was inside her. A room that had been there her whole life with the light off, and the door closed, and now the light was on. And she did not yet know what was in the room. Her mother had put her name on the account. Her mother had put her name on the account before Margaret had ever moved home. Before the diagnosis, before the falling and the forgetting. Margaret looked at the date of the first joint signature card stapled to the inside of the passbook. 1997. Margaret had been 15 years old, a sophomore at Brattleboro Union High. Eleanor had walked into that bank 26 years ago and put a 15-year-old girl's name on an account she had told no one about, and she had kept the account in that girl's name for the next 26 years. The ledger was harder. The ledger had her mother's handwriting on every page. She opened it to the first page. The date was January of 1982, 6 weeks before Margaret had been born. The handwriting was younger. The loops were the same loops, but they had less weight on them. The writing of a hand that had not yet held a sick child, or signed a husband's funeral papers, or buttoned a confused mother's cardigan in a snow-lit kitchen. I am 33 years old, the first entry began. I am 6 weeks from having my third child. Calvin is 8, Vivian is 5. Walter went back to the road on Monday and will be in Albany until Friday. I went to the attic this afternoon to look for the cradle, and instead, I found my grandmother's quilting frame. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to set it up in the cedar shed. I do not know yet what I will make on it. I only know that I need a place that is mine. Margaret closed the ledger. She put her forehead against the cool spine of it and breathed. She did not know how long she stayed there. The column of light from the high window moved a hand's width across the floor before she lifted her head. When she did, she heard very faintly from up the gravel path the sound of a car coming down the lane. A small green station wagon. She knew the car before she saw it. It belonged to Harriet Quinn, who had been her mother's closest friend for 52 years, who had run the fabric store on Elliott Street since before Margaret was born, and who had come to the funeral with a casserole dish and red eyes and had said almost nothing to anyone. Harriet parked at the top of the path and got out and looked down toward the shed. She was 70 years old, small and square, with hair the color of pewter cropped short against her skull. She was wearing a denim barn jacket and the wool scarf Eleanor had made her for Christmas 11 years ago, the one with the cardinals on it. She had a brown paper grocery bag in one hand. She walked down the path slowly. She stopped at the open door of the cedar shed and looked through into the open hidden doorway behind the wardrobe, and Margaret saw the moment her face changed. Not surprise, the opposite of surprise. Relief. You found it, Harriet said. Margaret stayed sitting on the floor. You knew. I knew, Harriet said. How long? A long while. Harriet set the grocery bag on the work table gently, the way a woman sets down something fragile. Margaret could see the top of a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel inside the bag. Margaret had not eaten anything that morning. She had not realized she was hungry until that moment. Your mother made me promise, Harriet said. The year you started high school. She sat me down at the counter of the shop after closing one Tuesday, and she said, Harriet, if anything happens to me before I finish, you do not tell Meg about the shed. You let Meg find it. And I said, Eleanor, what if she never finds it? And your mother looked at me with that look she had, and she said she will find it. She is the one who will look. Margaret put her hand against the floor. Why, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she had meant it. Harriet did not answer right away. She came into the hidden room slowly, the way a person enters a church. She walked once around the quilting frame. She put her fingers very lightly on the wooden edge of the half-finished farmhouse. She stopped at the third small figure, the child at the third upstairs window, the one who was still only a pencil outline. That was going to be Lily, Harriet said. She started that one the week Lily was born. Margaret closed her eyes. Why, she said again. Why all of this? Why not tell us? Why not tell me? Harriet came and sat on the floor beside her. It was not an easy thing for a 70-year-old woman to do, getting down onto a cedar floor. And Margaret thought, somewhere far back in the part of her mind that was still working as a nurse, that Harriet's hip was going to hurt her tonight. Harriet sat anyway. She folded her hands in her lap. Your mother started selling in 1985, Harriet said. She made a quilt for a neighbor's wedding gift, and the neighbor sent a photograph of it to her cousin in Boston, and the cousin called your mother and asked if she would make another one for a friend, and the friend paid her $400, which was a great deal of money in 1985, and your mother brought the check to my kitchen table and laid it down and looked at me and said, Harriet, I cannot tell Walter about this. Why not? Because of Calvin, Harriet said. Margaret turned her head. Calvin was 11 that year, Harriet said. He was already counting the change in your mother's purse when she was not looking. Your mother told me that sitting at my kitchen table with that check in her hand. She said Calvin found a $20 bill in the laundry last week, and he kept it. And when I asked him about it, he looked me right in the face and said he never saw any $20 bill. She said, Harriet, he is 11, and he already lies for money. She said if I tell Walter, Walter will tell the children, and Calvin will spend the rest of his life calculating what is going to be left to him. Harriet looked down at her own hands. I told her she was being unfair to a child. I told her you cannot judge a boy at 11 for the man he will be at 50. She did not argue with me. She just put the check in her pocket and went home. And the next month she came back with another check and put it in a savings account at the bank in Bellows Falls, where nobody in Brattleboro went, and she signed the account in her mother's maiden name. She did that for 12 years. Then she came home from your 15th birthday, and she moved the account to the Brattleboro Savings and Loan, and she put your name on it. Why mine? Margaret said. Because of the dishes, Harriet said. Margaret looked at her. You do not remember? Harriet said. You would not remember. You were 15. There was a girl in your class, a girl whose mother was sick. The family did not have much. Your mother told me. She said Meg has been packing 2 lunches every morning. She said, I noticed last week that we were going through twice as much bread as we used to. And I thought we had mice. She said this morning, I saw Meg put 2 sandwiches in 2 paper bags, and she put one in her own school bag and walked the other one down the road to the girls' mailbox before the bus came. She said Meg has been doing this since September, and she has not told anyone, not me, not the girl. And then your mother said to me, Harriet, that is the child whose name is going on this account. Margaret put her face in her hands. She watched Harriet, said quietly, Your mother watched everybody. She did not say much. She just watched. Outside the high window, a small wind moved through the maples, and a few more leaves came loose. Margaret did not lift her head for a long time. When she did, Harriet reached into the grocery bag on the work table and took out not the casserole dish, but a thin, glossy magazine. She held it out across the small space between them. This came in the mail at the shop 2 days ago, Harriet said. I was going to bring it to you next week. I thought maybe you needed another week. Margaret took the magazine. The cover was a photograph of a quilt against a white museum wall. The pattern was a winter farmhouse, snow on the roof, gold light in the windows. The caption underneath the photograph read, M. Whitcomb, Vermont Winter Series, on permanent loan to the Shelburne Museum Textile Collection. E. M. Whitcomb, Margaret said. Eleanor May Whitcomb. Harriet said. Whitcomb was your grandmother's maiden name. Your mother used it for 40 years. There is a small community of textile collectors in New England who would pay quite a great deal of money to find out who E. M. Whitcomb actually was. They have been trying for 35 years. Your mother never let any of them get close. Margaret turned the page. The magazine was a quarterly journal called American Quilter, and the lead article, 8 glossy pages of color photographs, was a retrospective. The headline read, The Hidden Hand of Vermont, 40 Years of E. M. Whitcomb. The photographs were of quilts Margaret had never seen, a log cabin in deep reds and creams hanging in a private collection in Connecticut, a double wedding ring in soft blues in a gallery in Portland, Maine, a Dresden plate that had sold at a Sotheby's textile auction 4 years ago for $34,000. Margaret read the figure twice. She read it a third time. $34,000, she said aloud. That one was a commission, Harriet said. There was a collector in New York who waited 11 years to be put on your mother's list. He paid her up front. She finished the quilt in 9 months and she sent it to him through the dealer in Boston. And the dealer in Boston sent her a check. And your mother used the check to put a new roof on this shed. Margaret looked up at the cedar ceiling of the hidden room. She had not noticed until that moment that the rafters were new. The wood was paler than the walls. There was no water stain anywhere. A new roof, she said, so the quilts would not rot, Harriet said. So whatever she was going to leave you would still be here when you found it. Margaret set the magazine down on the floor beside her. She did not trust herself to hold it any longer. She sat there. Harriet sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind died down and the orchard went very still, and the only sound in the world was the soft creak of the cedar walls and the distant tick of the grandfather clock from inside the house up the path where Lily was watching the cartoon with the rabbits and waiting for her mother to come back. After a long while, Margaret said very quietly, I have to tell my brother and sister. Harriet did not answer for a moment. Then she said, Your mother thought about that. She thought about it for 40 years. What did she decide? She decided you would know what to do, Harriet said, when the time came. Margaret picked up the ledger from the floor beside her. She turned to a page near the back, almost the last entry her mother had ever written. The handwriting was smaller now, more careful, the loops thinner. The date was 2 months before Eleanor had stopped writing. If Margaret is reading this, the entry began, then she has found her way in, and I am no longer here to tell her any of it myself. I want her to know 2 things. The first is that everything in this room is hers. The bank, the cloth, the frame, the name, all of it. I built it for her 1 stitch at a time, and I started before she was born, and I did not stop until my hands stopped. The second thing is harder. The second thing is that her brother is going to come for it. He will come kindly at first. He will come with a calculator and a soft voice, and he will say that this is what their father would have wanted. And Margaret will know that is not true because their father did not know about any of it. I am sorry to leave her this. I am sorry to leave her the work of saying no to a brother she loves. But she's the one who can. She has always been the one who can. The cross-stitch holds. Margaret closed the ledger. She put it back in the wooden box with the carved X's on the lid, and she closed the lid, and she pressed her palm flat against the wood, the way one presses a palm against the chest of someone who has just stopped breathing. Then her phone rang in her coat pocket. She did not have to look at it. She knew who it was. She had known somewhere since the moment she had taken the small brass key from Mr. Caldwell's hand in the law office on Main Street that this phone call was going to come, and that when it came, she would have to decide in the space of a single breath what kind of woman she was going to be from that moment forward. She took the phone out of her coat pocket. The screen read, Calvin. Margaret looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back at her, and Harriet's face was very still and very kind and very old. Answer it, Harriet said softly. He cannot hear what is in this room through a phone. Margaret pressed the green button. She lifted the phone to her ear. From 2,800 miles away in a corner office on the 11th floor of a hospital in Seattle, with the late afternoon light coming through tall glass windows over Elliott Bay. Her brother's voice came across the wire, as smooth and careful as a surgeon's first cut. Meg, Calvin said, I'm glad I caught you. Listen, I was going through some of Mom's old paperwork this morning, the boxes she kept in the hall closet, and I came across something I think we need to talk about. Margaret's hand tightened around the small brass key in her coat pocket. What did you find, Calvin? I found a deposit slip, he said, from a bank in Bellows Falls from 1988. It's made out for $400 and it's in Mom's handwriting, and it's signed with a name I have never heard before in my life. He paused. She could hear him breathing. Meg, he said, in the same soft, careful voice he had used in Mr. Caldwell's office. Who is E.M. Whitcomb? Margaret did not answer him for a long moment. She looked at Harriet, who had not moved, who was watching her with the calm of a woman who had already seen this conversation happen in her mind a dozen times over the past 8 months. E.M. Whitcomb, Margaret said into the phone, was a quilter. A quilter, Calvin said. She made quilts. There was a small pause. Margaret could hear faintly the sound of Calvin shifting in his leather chair, the soft hiss of an espresso machine somewhere behind him in his corner office. Meg. The deposit was for $400. In 1988. That's almost $1,000 in today's money. Mom didn't have that kind of money in '88. Dad was driving a regional route and barely clearing 30 a year. I want to understand what I'm looking at. You are looking at one deposit, Margaret said, from a savings account that belonged to Mom. She heard him exhale. It was the exhale of a man preparing to be patient with a sister he had decided was being slow. Is there more than one deposit, he said. There is, Margaret said. There are quite a few. How many? Calvin. I am not going to do this on a phone call. I'm going to fly out, he said. I know, I'll bring Vivian. I know that too. Saturday, Calvin said. The voice was no longer soft. It was the voice he used in his hospital. The voice he used to tell the family of a patient that the surgery was going to happen on Thursday, whether they were ready or not. Saturday is fine, Margaret said, and she hung up the phone before he could answer. She sat with the phone in her lap for a long minute. Harriet did not speak. The cedar walls warmed and clicked in the morning sun. Somewhere up the gravel path, the screen door of the mudroom banged twice in the wind and then settled. Tuesday, Margaret said. Today is Tuesday. That gives you 4 days, Harriet said. For what? To decide what kind of woman you are going to be when your brother walks down that gravel path on Saturday morning. Margaret put the phone down on the cedar floor. She looked at the quilting frame in the center of the hidden room, at the half-finished farmhouse, and the 3 small figures in the 3 small windows. The grandmother completed the mother, partly done the child, still only a pencil outline waiting. She did not feel like a woman who could decide anything yet. But she stood up. She did that much. She brushed the cedar dust off her jeans, and she helped Harriet up off the floor. And she walked Harriet back out through the wardrobe into the daylight. And she locked the brass padlock with the small brass key. And she put the key in her coat pocket. and she walked up the gravel path to her own kitchen, where her daughter was watching rabbits on television and waiting for her mother to come back. She made Lily a grilled cheese sandwich. She cut it into 4 small triangles. She sat down across from her daughter at the kitchen table and watched her eat. And she thought about Eleanor at 33 carrying her up the stairs from the cradle in 1982. She called Mr. Caldwell that afternoon. "Mr. Caldwell," she said when he picked up, "I think my brother is going to ask me some questions on Saturday morning that I'm going to have trouble answering. I would like to know if my mother left any documents with you that she did not read out at the will reading." There was a pause on the line. It was not the pause of a man who was surprised. It was the pause of a man who had been waiting for this phone call for 8 months. The way Harriet had been waiting for it, the way her mother had perhaps been waiting for it for 40 years. "Miss Ashford," Mr. Caldwell said, "I have an envelope in my safe with your name on the front of it. Your mother left it with me 21 months ago and asked that I not give it to you until you asked. She was very specific about that word. Asked. I am asking." Margaret said, "I will see you tomorrow morning at 9, he said. The envelope was thick. It was sealed with a small wax disc, the kind her grandmother had used on letters to relatives in Maine 50 years ago. Margaret broke the seal in her car in the parking lot of the law office with the heater running and a thin rain falling on the windshield because she did not trust herself to wait the 8 minutes it would take to drive home. Inside were 3 things: a folded legal document, a sealed letter addressed in her mother's hand to Calvin Walter Ashford and Vivian Ashford Hollis, and a single sheet of stationery cream-colored with a watermark of a sprig of lavender, and on it, in Eleanor's writing, a letter to Margaret. Margaret read the legal document first. It was a codicil, 6 paragraphs notarized witnessed by Harriet Quinn and a county notary in Putney, signed by Eleanor May Ashford, 21 months before her death. On a day Margaret now remembered as a day her mother had asked Harriet to drive her into town because she wanted to do a little errand and did not want to bother Margaret. Margaret had been grateful at the time. She had used the 2 free hours to take Lily to the library. The codicil stated in the careful, blunt language of a country attorney that all contents of the Cedar storage shed at the Putney Mountain Road property, including but not limited to fabric sewing equipment, completed and uncompleted textile work, written records, the joint savings account at the Brattleboro Savings and Loan, held under account number 4471, and all intellectual property associated with the working name E.M. Whitcomb, were the sole and exclusive property of Margaret Eleanor Ashford. From the moment of Eleanor May Ashford's death, regardless of any other provisions in any other document, it was airtight. Margaret had been raised in a family with a lawyer in it. She could read a document. There was nothing in this one for Calvin to break. She opened her own letter next. She read it sitting in the parked car with the rain ticking on the roof. Margaret. The letter began, "If Mr. Caldwell has put this in your hands, then you have already found the room, and you have already met E.M. Whitcomb, and you are sitting somewhere right now trying to understand a mother you thought you knew. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for the size of what I left you to carry by yourself. I want you to know that I thought about telling you 100 times. I almost told you the night your father died. I almost told you the morning you drove up the lane with Lily asleep in the back seat. I almost told you in the hospice bed in the last week when my hands could not hold a thread anymore, but my mind was still mine for 1 or 2 hours each afternoon. The reason I did not tell you is the same reason I did not tell anyone. The work was for you. It was always for you. And I knew that if I told you while I was still alive, you would have refused it. You would have said, 'Mom, sell the quilts. Pay for a real nurse, hire someone to lift you in and out of the bath.' You would have used my work to make my dying easier. And I did not want my dying easier. I wanted my daughter taken care of after I was gone. I wanted you to walk into that shed and find a life waiting for you. The shed is yours. The money is yours. The name is yours if you want it. Or burn the name and use your own. The work was never about the name. I love you, Margaret. I have loved you since before you had a face. The cross-stitch holds, Mom. Margaret folded the letter. She held it against her chest with the flat of her hand for a long time. The third item was the sealed letter to Calvin and Vivian. She did not open it. It was not hers to open first. Saturday came clear and cold with the kind of brittle sun that the New England October gives just before the trees go bare. Calvin's rental pulled into the gravel drive at 9:45. Vivian was in the passenger seat. Margaret was waiting for them on the porch with a thermos of coffee and 3 ceramic mugs and the small brass key in her coat pocket. She did not invite them inside. She walked them down the gravel path. She had decided in the 4 days she had been given that she would not argue. She had spent the 4 days reading her mother's ledger from the first page to the last. She had read every entry of 41 years. She had read about the Tuesday in 1991 when her mother had stayed up until 3 in the morning finishing a log cabin so it could ship to Boston on the morning bus. She had read about the spring in 2003 when Eleanor had taught herself a new applique technique from a library book because a collector in Maine had specifically requested it. She had read about the August in 2017 when Eleanor had written in a hand that was just beginning to tremble. Margaret called from the hospital. Lily was born last night, 7 pounds 2 ounces. She has my hands. I started the 3rd figure tonight. I do not know if I will finish her. By Saturday morning, Margaret no longer needed to argue. She unlocked the padlock. She slid the wardrobe sideways on its hidden track. She stood aside in the low cedar doorway of the hidden room, and she let her brother and her sister go in. Calvin stopped 3 steps inside the door. He did not say anything for a long time. She watched him take it in the frame, the shelves, the treadle, the pegboard. He was a surgeon. He was a man who counted things for a living. She could see him counting. She watched him reach the number 47, and she watched his face change. Vivian had walked to the quilting frame. She had put her hand on the wooden rail. She was looking at the 3 small figures in the 3 small windows. The third one, the child was still only a pencil outline. "That's Lily," Vivian said. Her voice was thin. "It is Margaret," said. Vivian put her face in her hands, and she stood very still, and her shoulders shook once, twice, and then she lowered her hands, and she looked at her younger sister with an expression Margaret had not seen on her face since they had both been small. "Meg," Vivian said, "I sent her 2 checks. In 6 years, I sent her 2 checks for $300, and I told myself that was something." Margaret did not answer. There was no answer to give that would help. Calvin had walked to the work table. He had picked up the leather ledger. He had opened it to a page somewhere in the middle, and he was reading. And Margaret watched the muscle work in his jaw, the way it had worked when he was 12 years old. And she had caught him lying about a $20 bill. Margaret took the sealed envelope out of her coat pocket, the one her mother had addressed to her brother and her sister 21 months ago on the same day she had signed the codicil. She held it out across the small space of the hidden room. "This is for both of you," she said. "Mom wrote it. I have not read it. I am not going to." Calvin took it. He looked at his name in his mother's handwriting. He sat down on the small bench against the wall, and Vivian came and sat beside him, and he opened the envelope. He read it aloud. Margaret had not asked him to. He did it anyway, perhaps because Vivian was beside him, perhaps because he was a man who had been trained his whole adult life to deliver hard news in steady sentences, and this was the only way he knew to receive it. "My dear children, I love you both. I want you to know that first, because what comes after may sound like I do not. And I want the first thing and the last thing in this letter to be the same thing. I love you both. but I have watched you for a long time, and I have watched your sister for a long time, and I have to write down what I have seen, because if I do not write it down, then it goes with me, and your sister will spend the rest of her life wondering whether I noticed. I noticed, Calvin. I noticed every month you did not come. I noticed every month you called for 19 minutes and asked one question about my health, and 40 minutes of questions about the value of the orchard. I noticed Vivian. I noticed the 2 checks. I noticed the card that came with the second one had a printed message and no handwritten word. I do not say these things to be cruel. I say them because they are true, and because the house went to Calvin because Calvin wanted a house. And the savings went to Vivian because Vivian wanted money. And the shed went to Margaret because Margaret was the one who would walk down the path and open the door. You do not inherit what you do not look at. I am sorry if this is hard to read. I think it is. I wrote it 3 times before I let myself write it once. The cross-stitch holds. I love you, Mum. Calvin folded the letter. His hands were not quite steady. He put it back in the envelope. He did not look at Margaret. Vivian stood up. She crossed the small room, and she put her arms around Margaret, and she held her. And she did not say, I am sorry, because Eleanor's letter had already used the only sorry that the moment could hold. Calvin stood up last. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at the half-finished farmhouse on the frame. He looked at the 3rd small figure, the pencil outline of his niece still waiting. I am not going to file anything, he said. I know, Margaret said. I should have come home, he said. Yes, Margaret said. You should have. He nodded once. He walked out of the hidden room and through the cedar shed and up the gravel path. Vivian stayed for another hour. She sat with Margaret on the floor of the hidden room, and they looked through the ledger together, and Vivian cried twice quietly, and at one point she said, Meg, will you teach me? I do not even know how to thread a needle. And Margaret said yes. That winter, Margaret turned the cedar shed into a place. She did not build it alone. Harriet came 3 afternoons a week. Theodore Brennan, who had been the boy Margaret almost married, came on a Saturday in November with a load of pine lumber on his truck and rebuilt the front step without being asked, and stayed for coffee and came back the next Saturday and the one after that. He did not push. He did not ask anything of her. He just kept coming with his quiet hands and his cedar shavings on his sleeves. And after a while, Margaret stopped flinching when she saw his truck come down the lane. Word moved through Brattleboro the way word moves through a small town in winter, slow and warm, and without anyone meaning to spread it. A woman from the library brought a sewing machine she did not need anymore. A retired school teacher dropped off a bag of cotton fabric on the porch with a note that said, for the new place, no need to thank me. The woman who ran the diner on Main Street sent down a pot of soup once a week. None of them said why. None of them needed to. By February, Margaret was holding her first class. 4 women came. By April, there were 11. They were women whose husbands had died, and women whose children had grown, and women who had left marriages that should have been left years before. They sat at the long pine table in the hidden room, and Margaret taught them what her mother had taught her at the kitchen table when she was 7 years old, which was that the cross stitch is the stitch that holds everything together when the other stitches give up. In May, Margaret finished the 3rd figure. She did it on a Saturday afternoon alone in the hidden room with the high window open and the smell of apple blossom coming in from the orchard. Lily had drawn a small picture of herself the week before on a piece of school paper, and Margaret had used the picture to choose the colors. The dress was lavender. The hair was the color of an old penny. The small hands at the windowsill were Eleanor's hands passed forward alive. She tied the last thread off on the back of the quilt. She did not cry. She had cried enough that winter to last her a long time. She rolled the quilt off the frame slowly. And she folded it once, and she carried it up the gravel path to the house, and she laid it across the foot of Lily's bed. That night, Lily slept under it. Margaret stood in the doorway of her daughter's room with the hall light behind her and watched her daughter breathe under the weight of 41 years of her grandmother's hands. Outside the bedroom window, the orchard was full of moths and the smell of apple blossom and the small chirp of the spring frogs down in the wet hollow at the back of the property. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked. The cedar shed at the end of the gravel path was dark and locked and waiting for Tuesday morning, when 11 women would come down the lane with their thermoses and their fabric bags and their hands that had not yet learned what they were capable of. Margaret put her palm against the doorframe. She thought about her mother at 33 climbing into the attic in January of 1982 to look for a cradle and coming down with a quilting frame instead. She thought about all the small invisible stitches a woman makes in the dark across a life that no one ever sees and no one ever counts, that hold a family together the way nothing louder ever could. She turned off the hall light. She went to bed. The cross-stitch holds. If you have ever been the child who stayed, the one who did the work. No one watched. Tell me in the comments tonight, what is the one quiet stitch you made in your own life that nobody ever thanked you for? I want to read every single one. Sleep well. The fire is going out. The story is over.